Greetings everyone. Welcome to the 7th edition of the Online Education Leadership Forum panel discussion series focused on transforming education for human flourishing. Thank you so much for investing your time with us on a weekday. My name is Aaryan Salman and I'm the moderator for this panel discussion. In the previous 6 editions of OELF, we explored the various dimensions of education in the times of Corona and beyond. Today, we have a stellar panel that will discuss whether we are ready to reimagine assessments in our series entitled Education in the Times of Corona. Today, we'll also be discussing the status, significance, strategies, and approaches that we must take towards ensuring that assessments can foster human flourishing. The recordings of the previous 6 panel discussions and the live broadcast of this panel discussion are available both on our website and on our YouTube channel. So you can subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. And those of you who are not able to connect with us on Zoom, you can move on to YouTube. Also, we'll be sharing relevant and related resources with you within 72 hours of this live broadcast. So check out the event page after 72 hours or follow us on our social media profiles to receive an update. As you know, we now live in an increasingly challenging and uncertain times with enormous changes and disruptions to our lives and our professions. It is a moment for us to assume active global citizenship and support those in need. Having said that, I would like to take this moment to mark a minute of silence for those who have lost their lives to this pandemic, the grieving individuals and families, and in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and around the world. Thank you. Now we ring the bell to thank and honor the healthcare workers, our educators, and others on the front line who are carrying out essential roles, selflessly continuing their day-to-day duties inside and outside the home in support of us all. Thank you. The Online Education Leadership Forum was started with the objective to provide a platform for education leaders to shape, empower, influence, and advance the discourse on and be a springboard aiding action towards transforming education for human flourishing. As we know, there are 3 major forms or natures of assessment: diagnostic assessments, formative assessments, and summative assessments. Because of the forced and unpredictable nature of school closures across the world, due to COVID-19, schools have moved to online or distance learning. Because of this, there are talks around education circles of having no assessments at all. So through this panel, we would like to discuss the significance of assessments. Are assessments and testing the same, or whether many of us end up interchangeably using them? We'll also talk about assessments in the context of COVID-19. How do you think assessments should work for children who are not being able to come online or who are not able to access learning in any form at this point in time? When we talk of assessments, is it only about academic stuff, or are we also looking at assessing social emotional learning and other areas of a child's development? So the panel is expected to shed a light on all these questions. The choices and course of assessments that we employ in education will determine the kind of system that the kind of system that we create in education. So While we try to attempt and delve deeper and explore practical strategies to ensure assessments, to ensure fostering of human flourishing, we would also try to answer other challenges that we face in the domain of assessments. Through the Education in the Times of Corona online series, the Global Citizenship Foundation and its Council for Global Citizenship Education are committed to supporting school leaders and educators in connecting experts, practitioners, and educational leaders from across the globe to discuss and share ideas, best practices, perspectives that would enable one to navigate and lead through this crisis. So our goal today is that whatever your role is in the education sector, that you will come away with something, a fresh idea, a new perspective, a new strategy that you can apply to be more successful at employing assessments and doing what you're doing best while shaping the future of education that we all wish to have. So here's the format to give you a brief idea of what to expect. First, we'll take a few minutes to briefly introduce our awesome panelists from United States, Europe, Singapore, and India. And in the second half of our time today, we'll open the floor to give you an opportunity to directly ask questions to the panelists by either posting your questions on the chat box or by virtually raising your hands by pressing the reaction button on the bottom of the screen. Also, please feel free to share your thoughts, your ideas in the chat section anytime during the discussion and create a learning and engaging experience for all. The idea is to navigate the present and upcoming opportunities, issues, and challenges together to be able to transform education for human flourishing. Sounds good? Great. Let's get started with the panel introduction. I take great pleasure to welcome Mr. Arijit Ghosh, Vice President at Education Quality Foundation of India. He started his career as a teacher and has held several positions at senior positions at organizations such as Macmillan Publishers, Pearson Education, and the British Council India. With experiences in large-scale assessments, teacher audits, curriculum design, and in the domain of 21st century skills and digital innovation, he has managed several capacity building programs involving organizations like DFID, MacArthur Foundation, UNICEF, and multiple state governments. He's also a recipient of the 2014 Global Teacher Accreditation Award by Cambridge Foundation for his work on critical thinking skills. Also, I take great pleasure in welcoming Ms. Mary Burns, a professional development specialist and senior learning technologist at Education Development Center in the US. She has designed national educational technology strategies for governments in Lebanon, Indonesia, Ecuador, Pakistan, and other countries, and also school districts in the US, and has also implemented online learning programs in the US, Georgia, Mexico, Ecuador, Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. She has won awards for teaching, curriculum development, and research, and has worked in 5 continents. Also, she is fluent in English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Peter Hall-Jonas, who is the CEO at the Spiral Partnership in the UK. He has had an illustrious career as an educator and a nationally recognized head teacher in the UK. He is a leadership, behavior, and culture change consultant and an international education advisor. He has engaged with schools, corporates, local and national governments across the world towards leadership development, national and local curriculum design, continuous school improvement, and effectiveness. It's my deepest pleasure to welcome Mr. Andrew Miller, who is the Director of Personalized Learning at Singapore American School in Singapore, where he leads the work on curriculum assessments and instructions. He has served as both a classroom teacher and as an instructional coach. He has also taught both traditional and blended models of learning. He's frequent contributor to Edutopia and is a consultant with ASCD. I take immense pleasure in welcoming our chairperson, Dr. Ashok K. Pandey. He is also the director of Alcon Group of Schools India. He's the author of Launch Inspiring Educational Leadership and Pedagogical Life Essays on Educating India. Now I open the floor by requesting Ms. Mary Burns. I open the floor by requesting Mr. Arijit Ghosh to make his initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaryan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from whichever part you are joining today. Talk about pressure. So I'm reminded of the opening batsman facing probably Brett Lee on a fast-paced walker pitch in Perth, but I'll try and do justice. Um, so basically, I'm a huge fan of Simon Sinek and his emphasis on the power of why and the three golden circles. So I'm going to add my perspective of assessments following his why, how, and what model. So to begin with, why do we assess? We assess to test the academic achievements of a student at a specific point and measure his or her progress between two such points and call out the improvement, hopefully. When we reimagine assessments, we need to redefine this purpose of assessments. The purpose of assessments has to broaden its boundaries, basically. We need to assess to reflect on our teaching styles, the pedagogy, to understand the psychological effects of assessments itself on a child. That's why you will hear more and more focus currently is now on assessing the social and emotional well-being of learners. We also need to reduce the stress factor and make assessments seamless and less threatening for a child to flourish. In the current education scenario, the often ignored or maybe not catered to is the group which is most vulnerable. By that, I mean students having minimum or no technological resources, or let's say children with special needs. We are missing the assessment component for this very critical and large group of learners. When we reimagine assessments, I think we need to address the needs of the most vulnerable. If we manage to get that right, means the right, if we manage to get it right for the most vulnerable, we will definitely be able to do justice to all learners. Unfortunately, currently, it is the other way around, where we try to fit in the most vulnerable to our existing system, thereby failing on many points. Moving on, how do we assess? We typically assess by handing a sheet having a list of questions, which the student writes within a stipulated time frame. Again, when we talk about reimagining assessments, we need to relook at the how. Now, students, if you think very critically, can either be assessed on what they say, or what they do, or how they perform in the classroom or in a project, in addition to the right, which we anyways are doing in plenty. So I think we need to look at avenues or options to assess the say and the do more. So there's a lot of discussion recently on the assessment of 21st century skills. That gets covered if we can expand how we assess our students. One easy way to achieve this is to provide options to the child as far as the assessment modes are concerned. Now, verbal narratives, let's say somebody doing a very creative presentation, somebody, let's say, typically a science student designing a prototype, or mere conversation, a deep conversation with a teacher can all be part of assessment modes. When we talk about pedagogy, we consider different pedagogical approaches in the learning process. But when it comes to assessment, is it fair to have only one approach or mode? I think this is something which we need to think deeper. The last bit, what do we assess? We unfortunately assess what a teacher has taught, not what a child has learned. Hence, very typically, at least in Indian context, you will hear a lot of statements like this, that this question was out of syllabus or this was not covered in the class. Also, when we think of assessments, it's only student assessments that predominantly come to our mind. When we reimagine assessments, we need to start assessing concepts rather than mere facts and figures. we as educators need to critically analyze and appreciate that there are topics in the curriculum which are absolutely crucial to know. And then there are some topics which are good to know. So currently, this indomitable interest of the teachers, of the educators to assess every single topic, I feel needs to stop. Also, can we be mature enough to start assessing the wider ecosystem? Can we assess the classroom transaction? Why I say this, because we at EQFI, we audit the skills of teachers and have realized that classrooms that engage its learners with more critical thinking and integrated learning philosophies tend to do well in the summative year-end assessments. So we need to become more data literate and critically use assessment data and identify other data points to give us meaningful feedback to alter our pedagogies and inputs. Now, it's basically a dynamic cycle, and assessments have a very, very crucial role to play in it. So I think I will stop here for the time being and allow my esteemed co-panelists to add their insights. Thank you, Aaryan.
Yeah, so now I yield the floor to Miss Mary Burns.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and try to get. We're going to start with a 5-minute presentation, so I'm going to try to keep mine in very quickly in 5 minutes. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And I'm just going to start with actually a very simple assessment question, and that is, excuse me one second. A boy throws a stone at 4 birds on a fence, and he hits one. And the question is, how many birds are left? So if you'd like to answer the question, feel free to use the chat. But I'll just go ahead and continue. The answer is obviously 0, because if you throw a stone at birds, they'll all fly off. So I just wanted to say that, technology could do a lot for this kind of question. It could automatically grade this question and get a score back to students in no time. It could add this question to a vast item test bank that then could be used to personalize assessment. Technology could vertically and horizontally align the question with a set of standards and provide analytics on how many students answered correctly. I could even create a simple, very engaging animation that shows a boy throwing a stone at a bird. There's so much that technology, and especially online platforms, could do with this question, except one thing. It couldn't make this a good assessment question. And that's really kind of the point of my talk today, is that we really don't need to, I don't think we need to reimagine assessment as much as we need to apply good assessment practices to online learning, which is something that I will do. So I won't repeat too much of what Arijit said, but when we're starting with assessment, I think we always have to begin with questions. Why do we want to assess? What do we want to assess? Which assessment tools do we want to use? What do we want to do with this information? And who gets to use this information? So once we answer these questions, I think we can begin choosing the right tools. So my motto in terms of online assessment, which I do a lot of, is the assessment first and the technology later. Arijit mentioned testing. Testing is a form of assessment, and it's often a very problematic form of assessment, particularly multiple choice assessments. I'll move on. There's an abundance, and part of the reason I wanted to show up a presentation is because I actually wanted to share some of these tools, which many of you may know, but many may not. I wanted to give folks an opportunity to take a screenshot. There's certainly an abundance of digital assessment tools and platforms, but if we don't know how to design good assessments, then using these tools is either ineffective at best or kind of garbage in, garbage out at worst. So I think a third point that's really important about assessment is that good questions matter. We often hear that questions are kind of the king of assessment, and good questions matter, but also feedback has to be part of assessment. And if questions are the king of assessment, then feedback is really kind of the queen of assessment. And again, feedback should be kind of focusing, and I have a graphic here that explains When I talk about focusing feedback, what that means, everything from centering on 1 to 2 key points, being objective, comprehensive, unbiased, simple, instructive, using a neutral tone, and above all, being generous. So I'll just conclude, is that really technology cannot make a poorly designed assessment better. It just scales poorly designed assessments to more people. And to develop good assessments, we really have to put in the work. And the hardest part of that is the stuff that happens offline, developing assessments that are reliable and fair and valid and transparent. So I'll stop there. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Burns. So I request Mr. Jones to make his initial remarks.
Thank you, Aaron. Hello, everybody. Greetings to you wherever you are in the world. I'm coming here to you from the UK, where our schools have begun to open, but we are still working with a large number of children who are learning at home. My lovely colleague Arijit talked about Stephen Seneca, and I want to share with you another favourite model, which I know Arijit enjoys. I just hold it up to the screen to keep it easy for you. I won't refer to it too much detail. This is Costner's model of effective change. Many of you are nodding and know about it. So we need to have the vision. I don't think we have a vision for the future of assessment. I think we have a vision of what we don't want. I don't think we've agreed yet on what we do want, but I think that's a starting point. And I think if we can flip the opposite of what we don't want, we'll get closer to what we do want. In terms of skills, I think we have a real skills shortage across the teaching professions around the world when it comes to assessing children in any subtle or sophisticated ways because of the huge issues around teacher bias. And there's a great deal of research around that, around the very poignant reference to Black Lives Matter. We know the impact upon teacher assessments of so many different groupings of young people. I think incentive, I think we've got a huge incentive to change the way we approach assessment. However, we also know that bringing about and embedding change is a huge challenge in any sector, not least education. When it comes to resources for effective change, again, I think within the education sector, we might struggle for resources. A lot of my work is also in the commercial sector, and the commercial sector are abundant in resources when it comes to appraisal. And in my later remarks, I'll be extolling the virtues of moving from assessment to appraisal. And lastly, action planning and the need for us to come together as a global profession with our commercial and education and higher education partners to bring about a global change, because I don't think this is anything that can be done unilaterally. I think across the globe, we need to agree on where we're going to go with assessment. Otherwise, we'll fall with the lowest denominator. So for me, I want to offer participants a series of questions based upon a continuum. So thank you, Mary, for giving us that lovely visual. Personal views. I want to encourage people to reflect on the experiences of COVID, where it seems to me that assessment is moving from judgmental to developmental. It seems to me that the vast majority of teachers are engaging with children on various platforms where they can, whether that be text, WhatsApp, or online, to understand where children are at, not in order not to judge them, but in order to help them with developmental needs. So assessment is developmental rather than judgmental. The second one for me is this notion that was already being picked up by my colleagues around assessing the application of skills and knowledge rather than merely revising knowledge. And I think, although I understand, and Andrew will talk more about the Singapore model, which the crisis model that you talk about, Andrew, which was about revisionist in a sense and maintaining where we are with learners, is in other situations where teachers have said, okay, well, you learned that before lockdown, let's see if we can apply it to new and innovative and novel situations. So assessment as application rather than revision would be my other continuum. Again, picking up on Arijit's points now, that assessment, I think, will become more diagnostic and less damning. It seems to me that for majority of learners, assessment is about damnation. Mary talked about generous feedback, and I think that's a worthy and that clearly a very vital element. But I think for most learners, assessment is damning. So I think we're going to move much more towards a diagnostic as opposed to damning. Also picking up on Mary's points about the king and queen of assessment, of questions and feedback, I think assessment is moving much more efficiently towards being a process for generating quality feedback. In its own right, the assessment is merely there as a vehicle for feedback. So again, my continuum would be moving from assessment for data to assessment for feedback. I think another notion would be that because of children's well-being, their mental health, their physical well-being, their emotional states, I think assessment is moving. I think we've had a big leap forward now in teachers and educationists around the world, been interested in 360-degree appreciation of learners and not just a narrow focus. A 360 appreciation of students in order to include the learning and the skills and the qualities and the attributes and the needs of all children, rather than a very narrow focus in education in order to exclude some children from certain hierarchies of education. I think another thing we're finding during COVID, which I think is a big leap forward, is that assessment is at the centre of curriculum, no longer at the end of the syllabus. So that big leap, I think, has been made. Two more things. I think there's that classic line about it's not how intelligent you are, it's how you are intelligent. And I think that COVID and teachers reaching out to kids in their homes has really helped us leap forward in that understanding. It's about the learning that you are able to do in your home setting, in your village setting, and how that learning can be brought into the curriculum, as opposed to you haven't learned anything, what have you learned? And I think the other big step forward is teachers' embracing of AI. And if the embracing of AI and what that can contribute to assessment means that once and for all, we can knock the idea of IQ into a box, and we can talk about what children know as opposed to what children don't know, I think that'll be a huge leap forward that has been brought about in part by the COVID experience for teachers and learners.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Jones. Now I'd like to ask Mr. Miller to make his initial remarks. Thank you.
Good evening from Singapore. I feel like I should, initially I was going to make some points, but I found that my panelist friends have done all of that and are repeating a lot of what I was going to share. So instead, I think I'll share kind of what Singapore American School is doing as a way to illuminate what has been shared as in this idea of what could it look like? Because we've been working for a long time on this, on reimagining assessment. So I'll share some key points and bring some ideas out. The first thing is, we've created a clear mission and vision for our students. And part of that has, you've heard of the 4 C's, right? It was already mentioned, this idea of, I don't like using the word 21st century skills because we're in the 21st century, but whatever you want to call them, we've listed things like critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration, and content knowledge and cultural competence as key learner outcomes for our students, because we value that. We value the content knowledge, but we also value the skills. And what we're doing out of that is we are building a competency-based framework and mapping system so that you break down collaboration into certain types of skills, like engaging in teamwork, which includes things like monitoring progress and managing challenges, to navigating conflict, which includes, recognizing and managing your emotions in that type of conflict. And we've built out these learning progressions that allow for teachers to align assessments to them so that we can give feedback on the things that we value. I find all too often, and we say we value these things. Well, if we value, then you need to assess them. What gets assessed gets done. And for too long, we've assessed at that, Arijit was talking about that rote, knowledge, because we're saying that's what we value. That's what the system has created for us. Well, if you want to change that, then you need to change the system of assessment and really examine what do you want to assess and how will you do it. And so we're going to be building out these competencies, and teachers are already starting to implement them in their classrooms where they're explicitly teaching and explicitly assessing them. And again, none of these are getting graded. This is the key here. None of it is graded. It is simply feedback and reporting. And students will still do it because they value the feedback and they find it to be important. So anybody who says, well, what about a grade? That's a total non-starter and doesn't need to be part of this conversation. We can move past traditional grading things. We can report out and share and monitor where students are at. And there's many groups like the Mastery Transcript Consortium has got together this group of people to re-envision the transcript to reflect post-grading. What would it be like to do that? And I think in a time like now, where we're dealing with this challenge of being online and in distance learning, having a quote unquote report card or transcript that is more fluid and reports better data and values different data solves a lot of those problems with, well, what about this test? And I'm worried about academic honesty. The other component of this is just was said earlier, this idea of performance-based assessments. What teachers have been doing is designing embedded performance assessment inside of their curriculum. It's embedded, it's not at the end, it's part of a unit, it's part of the year. It assesses a competency and it assesses a content standard. So we're looking for both those things, and then we share out that information because we know that students have to apply their knowledge, as Peter was saying. So we have those as more valuable assessments. And the funny part has been, we've been doing this for a while. So when COVID came and people were like, how do we deal with assessment? The teachers that had embraced performance assessments were like, we got this. The kids were like, we got this. The teachers that hadn't and had done more traditional exams, they were the ones that were struggling and had to kind of go back to it. So it's really about, for me, it's assessing what matters is the number one thing, and then ensuring that you're using more performance-based assessments that actually will assess it regardless if it's online, digital, in-person, conversation, podcast, project, doesn't matter. And then the last thing I will say is when we think about refining and redesigning is this idea of, why are we so time-based? I don't understand it. If anything that this has taught us, it's that kids are learning slower in this, so we need to be responsive to that. And why are we freaking out that they're not getting to it by this date? That's just the way it is, and we need to be responsive to it and say, some students will get it here, here, there, in different times and places, and that's great. And so we need a system that doesn't penalize kids for not getting it on Monday and actually allows them to say, that's cool, let's figure out what that next step is in your learning. Or if somebody wants to get it earlier than Monday, why is Monday the day? I don't understand. That's an arbitrary construct that I've created in my classroom to sort students rather than rewarding them for their funds of knowledge that we've done. And these are pretty, you might consider these radical, but there are some really important things that we need to wrestle with if we're really trying to think about equity, if we're really trying to think about reimagining and doing purposeful, different types of ways of assessing students.
Thank you so much, Mr. Miller. I request Dr. Pandey to make his remarks.
Thank you, Aaryan. So, Andrew was saying that before him, everything was said, from broadening the scope of assessment to quality feedback, to assessment for not judging but development. And after that, illumination was left, which Andrew has already done. And therefore, for me, only thing left is that I raise some questions. Because question and answer session is already going to follow. And therefore, give me a minute. I would like to share some questions. So here is one. If you can see this, in a football field, the coach says, the dream big, kid, you can do anything. And in a maths class, dream medium, kid, you can do something probably. So where is our assessment here? The football coaches say that you can become Pele, you can become Ronaldo, but we don't say children that you can become Hardy, Newton, Ramanujan, Julia Robinson, or Catherine, the famous female mathematicians. So that is one question that I have. The second question is that we are going to profess, and we are already living in the glory of preferred learning, experiential learning, growth mindset, interdisciplinary learning, and self-directed learning. And therefore, our assessment has to respond to this. So what is that ideal assessment which is going to respond to these preferred learning things? And therefore, my 4 or 5 questions are, what is the purpose of schooling? We are preparing them for life, or we are preparing them for college, university, and career? And if it is the former, then what should be the best assessment? It should be a school-based assessment, or it should be external board, administered test. This is the question that we have to examine. Inclusive assessment is suffering. We are only throwing children out of the system because we have a standard test and we are benchmarking their abilities and learning against that external thing, and that is creating a lot of confusion and problem. Can learning be quantified? This is one question which is bothering me for a very, very long time, that very high percentile is more important, or highest incredible contribution to the world through service, initiatives, projects, which they tried for the first time, they succeeded, they failed, they lived through that, and they created a pathway to live their dreams. Are we going to assess that? Are we going to tell them that no, in numeracy, literature, you've got 90 percentile or 100 percentages or whatever it is? So this is something, these are the 5 questions that I'm raising, and I'm in a way appealing to the entire education fraternity that we have to be ready to be comfortable with a lot of uncomfortable things as far as assessment is concerned. And here is a quote. The truth is, it is not that hard to do things right in the kindergarten, to do things in such a way that optimum learning is accomplished and the child experiences joy, growth, and even wonder. Now to do this, I think grading them or telling them that you are A+ or you are B+, or if you don't come for the test, this will happen, how we are going to create the joy and growth and wonder in the child is something which is bothering. And now, of course, here is a sample of one assessment is about a child whose assessment was, the child herself said that I am a leader. One of the books that the child preferred first, I am a leader. So what kind of books children are reading? One book that she read was Rani Lakshmibai. She is one of the valiant queens of freedom fighting in India. And the teacher said that you're very good in ideation, you're very good in creative writing, your expressions are absolutely fantastic, you're very good at free expression. And when we look back 14, 15 years of journey of that child, we find that the child is absolutely flourishing. She has a voice, she's very expressive, she's a great communicator and public speaker. So all these assessments in words and descriptions, how does it affect the children? And how does it propel and give impetus to their learning and growth is also a form of assessment which should be inbuilt, rather than just quantifying the percentages and labeling it once for all that this is what you are and this is what you go and enter the world. So these are some of the questions I'm leaving. I have not given the answers for want of time, but all the panelists have reflected on these things, and probably we can build it on in the remaining time that we have. Thank you, Aaryan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. Now we have a question and answer round with the panelists. So I would request the panelists to volunteer and ask the question to another panelist.
So I can straight away jump in and ask Andrew Miller because he was my predecessor speaker. So Andrew, any reflection on some of the questions that I have raised and how we can convert our assessments to build lives rather than just putting them into the next college?
Yeah, I think, some of what you're talking about hints at what we're trying to do at the school that I'm at, right? And really try to assess the skills that matter, that are transferable in uni, in a work, in a career, whatever you're doing, it's assessing what matters. I think that's the first step. You also hinted on this idea of student engagement. I think is kind of what I heard in that last component, this idea of like, why can't assessment be a joyous experience? Like, so, I'll be honest, like, I think it's interesting that when we say assessments, a lot of us just go, oh, and we just kind of, it's not like you go, oh boy, assessment. Nobody says that because it has this cloud and baggage that it's held for years. And I think if you start to invest time in designing meaningful performance tasks that connects to students' lives, that are relevant and interesting and novel, as was said earlier, I think that actually will help students. And again, it moves away from the grading component because it's just, this is a fun, learning experience. I think I like to think of assessment not only as a great measure of learning, but also a great learning experience in and of itself.
Absolutely.
At least that's what I would like to be. So
Absolutely.
I'm two ideas.
Thank you, Andrew. Very enlightening. Absolutely, thank you.
Andrew, may I just piggyback on the back of that?
Sure.
The imposition of assessment is the judgment. Someone is assessing me, and so therefore, if it's my wife, I immediately become defensive, and I exaggerate my performance, and I apply my wit to convincing her rather than applying my wit to getting better. So I find that externalization, someone is assessing me, that's part of the problem, it seems to me. It seems to be about power and control, authority and subordination. I have, you haven't. I'm here, you're not. So I think one of the things that interests me about, if I could, on the back of what you were saying, was around competency, around the joy of learning, and that assessment is a fundamental part in the joy of learning. And now for some people that will be a quick quiz, and I think during lockdown we've all been doing Zoom quizzes with our family, and there are clearly some people who love knowing something. They love knowing who was the 12th batsman to score 100. We love that, seems to be some, and kids have that pleasure too. But for me, when I see the kids playing on their games and I see other areas of my life, it is the stage, not the age of my learning that appeals to me. So I've been learning how to do Zoom. I am at stage 1. I happen to be 60. And so what I anticipate about your work in Singapore with competencies is can we move from stage, from age to stage? I am at this stage in my learning and I can get better. I'm here at the moment. I can't do it yet. Rather than, heck, it's Monday. I can't do it, I'm going to be demoted. What's the experience in Singapore of stage rather than age?
Yeah, I mean, let's be very honest. We still run up against very traditional structures of time and the Carnegie unit and grading and reporting. So I'm not saying that we're getting rid of our grade book, but what we're trying to do is push it in a way so it becomes a little more flexible with the competencies specifically. So one thing we've done is instead of when we wrote out the competencies and how the learning progressions, they're not by grade level, they're just by stage. So we have 1 through 5, that's it. And so no matter if a student is in this classroom at this grade level or this, they're at that stage, and all they can do, that's the other thing, is level up. There's no going backwards. Like, that's the other thing, is this is not about deficiency, it's what students can do. And I think we also hope to, because I really appreciate your comment around power. Why am I the one giving the assessment? Show me what you know, kids. What do you want to give to me so that I can help you and then report out on it? Like, student directed and student generated assessment, I think also helps with that component too.
Yeah, absolutely. So our role, essentially, what both of you have said, is more of giving that quality feedback that you mentioned, that what you are best at, rather than what you are worst at. I think that distinction needs to be made in one way or the other.
I have a question for Mary. You were sharing some of your ideas around feedback, and I think one of the challenges some of our teachers are facing is the volume of feedback that even want to do it because it's so powerful. What strategies have you learned around the volume of feedback and how to manage that as an educator?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can give feedback on everything. And then I think you have to diversify who it is that gives feedback. I mean, that's why peer feedback and peer assessment is so powerful. But I think we have to teach people how to do this because it's not, you have to teach, because feedback has to be resonant and it has to be specific and structured enough that it's actually useful and helps students close the gap between where they are and where they need to be. So in my own teaching, where I did a lot of peer feedback, and I should also mention that now that teaching that I do is with people who are studying to be teachers or who are teachers. I do a lot of pre-service and especially in-service professional development. So I think there's the, how to do the feedback, how to communicate feedback in ways that are resonant. And of course, to use to use self-assessment to help students really reflect and use these metacognitive strategies to see where they are and what they've done well and what helps them do well. And, again, I'll put this in an online environment, especially now in an online environment, how do I work? What do I need? How am I not working? What do I need to fix? How do I make a schedule, et cetera? But I don't think I don't think you can give feedback on everything. I've tried to do that and I've made that mistake. So I think, doing rapid fire feedback is good. Choosing what's most important, choosing one or two things. And then there's, the reason I wanted to show my PowerPoint presentation, besides the birds, was, there are a number of tools, Kaizena, other things that allow you to do kind of really, this is where technology does help assessment in terms of, how to give feedback using digital tools for feedback. I wanted to bring up one point quickly, actually. There's two themes that I wanted to mention, but actually I realized this quite a monologue I just went on, so maybe I should stop and let someone else talk, and I'll come back to the two themes that I wanted to raise, primarily from what Andrew and Peter had to say, if you'd prefer that.
Absolutely. So, all right.
Can I just
yes.
Yeah, I just want to, it's a fabulous discussion which many of my co-panelists have talked about, the importance of feedback, and Mr. Pandey actually talked about the quantification of learning. And specifically in Indian scenario, there is this huge rush for marks and the standardized testing, which when it comes to the standardized testing, I'm sure the high stake examinations, every country, there is this importance of marks for college examinations. And that's where from the internal build of humanity, I would say, that the entire scope of, let's say, cheating and use of unfair practices come into the picture. And I think in this scenario, when there is an online assessment system where teachers are struggling to make, I would like to pose a question to my co-panelists, that what is your view on online proctoring of exams, especially in the K-12 space? Is it really necessary? If it is not, then how do we actually tell our students that to teach, how do we teach honesty basically when it regards to assessments?
I mean, I'll take a first stab at that. I think, oftentimes assessment issues and cheating issues are really instructional design issues. They're really about how you've, the kind of assessment that you're using, the kind of instruction you've used, and how, and about test designs or assessment design. So what is your assessment? If and we're hearing a lot of that now in the age of COVID, teachers are saying, well, they're looking it up on Google. And like, well, if they're looking up on Google, why? I mean, of course they are. I look everything up on Google too. So why wouldn't they? So I think it's, how are we instructing students? Are we really doing, if we're doing kind of traditional fact-based instruction, and then our assessments are measuring discrete facts or procedures, then of course we're going to get some cheating. So, I think it really is about creating assessments for kids that are project and performance based. Now that was hard in this particular environment because a lot of kids didn't have technology and they were cut off from one another. But, if you can create things, assessments that are far more personalized, that are project based, that are alternative, where I think, Andrew, where you said giving students a choice, where you design things that maybe part of them are Googleable, but actually it's more about really understanding students, not just knowledge about facts and procedures, but really their conceptual knowledge, and not simply measuring cognition, but measuring student affect and their beliefs and their aptitudes and their values. I think you'll have a lot less cheating. The problem is that I think what you refer to too, Arijit, is this whole notion of assessment and the whole purpose of assessments. And that this was going to be one of my comments, is that what we're really seeing here is the tension between individual assessment and systemic or bureaucratic. We've bureaucratized assessment. And why is that? Well, in India, so that there's only so many places at the IIT, and in Singapore, you can only study so many things. And in the UK, there's the two, great universities that everybody wants to get into. And, so we assess summatively, we treat knowledge as a fixed point in time, and we use these high stake assessment systems for sorting and credentialing to say that, yes, you can go to Cambridge. And since there's only so many places at Harvard, you get to have one of those places. And I would even argue that in some systems, like the West African baccalaureate system, you assess to keep people out of the system, not even to sort them through the system. And I think that's where we get back to this notion of cheating again. And there are ways around this. I mean, there's cameras, there's invigilators. When I taught in Jamaica, I was an invigilator. I walked around as my students took the O levels and A levels, and I watched them like hawks about to pounce on a mouse. And, there's all kinds of programs right now that can detect if students are cheating or not cheating. You can stagger questions. This is where adaptive testing is wonderful, because it can spew out different questions to different students at different times if you have a really strong, well-developed test item bank. So there are definitely ways around this, but I think this goes back to this tension of just the teacher's individual use of assessment, which is often for formative purposes, and the system, the bureaucracy's use of assessment, which is really about credentialing, certification, sorting, placement, and is much more focused on these high stake exams where kids then do cheat because, yeah, I can't get into Harvard or Cambridge or IIT if I don't.
If I can, on the back of that, Mary, that of course the performative nature of some assessment is now affecting teachers when pupil performance is attached to teacher salary and remuneration and power. And though I would never accuse a teacher of cheating, the unintended consequences and the unintended consequences to pedagogy and the choices that teachers make based on the premise that the children's performance score is going to impact upon their status is hugely significant. And it comes, this is all about power. Because of course the tension we've then got is teacher bias and how teachers view the performance of ethnic groups, gender groups, whatever it might be, social groups. And again, I'm the last person, I'm a teacher, I'm married to a teacher, I'm a son of a teacher. I'm never going to knock teachers. But my bias as a white, middle-aged, tall, middle-class man from England, my bias is something that I'm wholly responsible for, and how we educate me and people like me to be aware of our subconscious bias, the ultimate conundrum, in these teacher assessments is a huge area, I think, that assessment needs to explore and conquer, because until we conquer those needs that teachers have, fair assessment, fair evaluation, fair appreciation, fair appraisal of children is still some way distant. Again, in Singapore, Andrew, how are you educating teachers to grade by stage fairly?
You know, that's just a whole, I mean, one of the tools we use is we use professional learning communities as our model of teacher collaboration. And that helps us to norm assessments in many ways, so that teachers aren't that biased that you say, it's natural, it's a natural thing, doesn't get in the way. So that really helps when we have an assessment that's more performance-based. We say, so why did you put them in that stage of their learning? Oh, I see why, I didn't notice that. So that helps, which also supports teacher learning and just being better at assessing of learning. Because I think, Mary, you were talking about it, like that's a huge growth, I think, for teachers. When I jumped into teaching, I did not know how to assess a darn thing. Like, even with those methods classes, I was not prepared. So there has to be ongoing professional learning in assessment literacy for teachers that I think we haven't quite done yet.
I mean, I was going to just jump in and respond to that, Peter, because of course there's bias. I mean, we're all biased. And I think, you know, at least the teachers I work with, especially when we're doing open-ended assessments, I think teachers recognize that. You know, I mean, I was a teacher for many years, and I had kids I loved, and I had kids that I didn't love as much. And, you know, that obviously, you know, there's the halo effect. There's these well-documented psychological effects that, you know, we like someone, we grade them better. It's the halo effect, et cetera. And so I think teachers are aware of that. And that's why, you know, for example, we design rubrics, because we are trying to minimize our subjectivity and our bias as much as we possibly can to create something that's objective. And that's, I think, communicating with students and having students be part of that assessment is so important.
Arijit, your core skills, teacher bias, has that been an issue, or has core skills been one of those things that Andrew was referring to, where if you see it, you see it, and we can remove a lot of the bias? Are you there, Arijit? Is that something you might respond to?
Okay.
Sorry, Peter, can you just repeat? I didn't get that.
With your work on core skills and your interest in whatever we call 21st century skills, teacher bias is an issue? A fair assessment of skills has been an issue, or it's been something that people largely have managed well?
No, my understanding or my experience when I've got the inputs after interacting with hundreds of teachers is basically what Mary pointed out, the formation of the rubric. So I think first that is a challenge. So teachers sometimes find it difficult to actually frame rubrics, which will allow them to put students into that continuum. So I think that is one. Not much about the biasness over here, I would say, because again, when it is, Mr. Pandey, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but if it is not a marks and a number associated to a kind of assessments, I think as students or as teachers, we tend to do a decent job. The biggest problem comes in when it comes to high-stake examinations and the marks.
Yeah, absolutely. Just for a minute to back up on. So biases are not the issue, Peter, as much as perhaps inadequacy of preparedness to evaluate the children through a rubric. And the problem may arise at the borderline cases, to put it in category A or category B, not born out of biases, but maybe born out of a lack of complete understanding and data. But the second thing I wanted to come in response to all those things, that the research of Carol Dweck and the power of yet that she has talked about, and she did an experiment on the children by giving them a very challenging problem. And she came out with two sets of children. One of them, they did not know the problem, but they said, no, we will do it. And we will reach up to that. And she described them as a growth-minded children. And another set of children, they said that, oh my God, it is too difficult. I just cannot do it. And next time, if you give a question like this, we are going to cheat it, you know. So the question is, what is the degree of difficulty you bring in your assessment? And what is the attachment you do to the outcome of that result? So if the attachment is very strong, and if it becomes a question of life and death, then you are pushing people to get into something which will be difficult to manage. So these are 2 or 3 aspects which are very, very necessary. And as long as the outcome of that assessment is going to decide something big, as Burns said, in terms of admission to IIT or Harvard or institutions like this, then probably problems will arise and we cannot avoid it.
I just want to mention one thing to everyone. As the only woman on this panel, there is always bias, and let us not forget that there is gender bias. And how the research is very clear on how teachers frame assessments actually impacts student performance. So for example, if teachers say, I'm going to give you a mathematics test, and this is going to test your competence in mathematics, girls always perform worse because women everywhere have been conditioned to believe that we understand math and science less well than men. And similarly, the opposite is true, that when teachers, and this is the research of Claude Steele, who looks more at race, but also gender, when a teacher sets up a reading exam and says, this tests your reading comprehension, no mention of gender, boys perform worse because boys across the world in almost every country score lower on tests of reading comprehension and reading fluency than girls do. So, India is a very diverse country in terms of the tribes and religions and castes, and as is, the United States is a diverse, every place is diverse, but, I just want to mention that the gender bias is very, very strong as well, and it plays out in assessments.
Thank you so much, everybody. We come to a conclusion of this round. So I have a few questions to each of the panelists. So my first question is to Mr. Miller. You have been talking about your school taking up personalized performance-based assessments. Now, a lot of us, from the periphery or outside might not understand that. So can you give a practical example of how you have embedded it in the lesson plan or the session?
Sure, yeah. This will be a really quick dry run of how to design a performance assessment. And there's a lot of resources out there for you to look into from the experts. But really, it is about starting with the learning targets. You start with what do you want students to know and be able to do. You have to start with that. And that could be content or skills or competencies or concepts, but you have to know what those things are. And many of those things come from our standards or whatever curriculum benchmarks we have, whether it's state, provincial, government, and we're held to them, and usually those are the things that are assessed, frankly, on the external exams that many of us are held pressure to. And from that, you need to think about, well, and I come from a huge PBL background. I taught in a very project-based learning school. It's what kept my passion for education alive. And I was helping students who were pushed out of the system in an alternative program doing performance-based assessments. And so what you do is with that, and I think what you can do is either the teacher can design that performance assessment, which is a novel and novel context, an application of the context. And one way I always think about it is like, okay, so here's I'm supposed to teach something about linear equations and something about and how they intersect and cause I'm like, okay, well, why is this even important ever? Like, why does this even matter? Whoever uses this, because the kids want to know. They're like, why is this important? So you said, well, okay, well, maybe I could give them like a scenario where they're doing like a cost benefit analysis or something. Same thing, exponential functions, who cares? Well, actually, we're going through a pandemic right now. We could totally explore R-naughts and different diseases. So you got to think of a context to situate that learning in and then give them a challenge. And it needs to be a multi-step challenge. It's not just a quick item. It's not an item in an online thing where it's like, a word problem. It's an extended set of steps that students have to go through, and that they do, that will ultimately, and then they perform at the end to show what they've learned. So they might question and research and investigate and trial and error and revise and then perform. And again, I want to echo what Mary said. You have to do this for everything. You do it on the most essential learning, and Arijit talked about that too, what's need to know and nice to know. You need to go through your curriculum, and what we do is we prioritize our standards. And this is very normal for people, but in the age of COVID, we reprioritized. We took it from this to this to this, and focusing our assessments on those key things that matters. And by the way, if you're interested in that, look into Larry Ainsworth's criteria. He has this idea of, is it something that requires readiness for something later? Leverage, as in it's leveraged in a high way. Is it assessed on an external exam? And like those criteria help you figure out what is essential.
Mr. Jones, you had spoken about, thank you so much. So Mr. Jones, you had spoken about the fact that we need to focus on what we don't want in the system. So if I have to ask you 3 things that you don't want in assessments, what are the 3 things and why do you think they're important?
Okay. I don't think we need to focus on what we don't want. I think that's our starting point. I think people are I think educationists, parents, students are clearer about what they don't want. I think that is a route to working out, therefore, what we do want. So that was my point. So my 3 things that we don't want. Gosh, okay. I couldn't do it then, but I can do it now. I think it's the finality. I think that I'm still referenced. If I apply for a visa, I'm going to need to get out my exam papers from when I was 15. And that is still a marker of me. And I find that extraordinary that in any other way, I'd be referenced back 45 years. So I think that's an extraordinary poor idea that you'd reference anyone back to a previous mistake. If you go to prison, it's wiped clean. You move on from any crime. So that's a job. I think for me, another thing that I would want to get rid of is the different. I think COVID has been really, really useful. I think COVID has expressed to us who's important. We've clearly needed great doctors. We've also needed great problem solvers. We've also needed great nurses. We've also needed great parents. We've also needed great engineers. And I think it's really leveled out and really challenged what is important. And the old importance of purely academic ability, I think, has been challenged, hopefully irrevocably. So I get rid of that. I want my doctors to know their chemistry. I want my engineers to know their physics. I'm not anti-knowledge at all, but there are, it's how you are clever. That's really important. A third thing that I would want to get rid of, I would want to get rid of any belief that marking work is assessment or that marking work is feedback. Marking work is just spending more time away from your families. It's not the marking of the work is largely irrelevant. It's what you do with the thinking and what you do with the love and the empathy for your learner that has come as a consequence of the marking. And if I could stop teachers marking work as if that was the end, but say, and there are all sorts of very innovative ways of assessing work quickly. What's important is my snapshot. What does this kid need to learn less? Why has this kid not learned it? So I think to get to disaggregate, to disassociate marking from assessment. I think. Mary, is that okay to say that?
Yes. So my next question is to Ms. Burns. So basically, we talk about biases, and we are talking about how it affects young people and how it affects everybody. So in the online context, how can a teacher ensure that he or she takes everybody along and the assessments are not damning as Mr. Jones had spoken of? So how can we ensure that assessments are for flourishing and something that makes children enjoy it?
I mean, I think, I'll go back to, something that I believe very strongly. So I think that, and I'll reflect on myself. I mean, I taught for 10 years, and as Andrew said, I've learned more about assessment being out of teaching kids and working with teachers. So we're not taught in pre-service education about assessment, about measurement. So what do you have to know to design good tests? You have to know measurement. You have to know item response theory. You have to know a certain amount of statistics, because every assessment has error. It's built into the system. Every test has a measurement of error. We have to know neuroscience, how people learn. We have to understand psychology. We get none of that. So I think a lot of problems with assessment are because assessments are designed really poorly. And, particularly kind of classical assessments like testing, like multiple choice tests. There's so much so that they're actually supposed to be a very good measure of student knowledge if they have high discriminating power, if each test item has high discriminating power. But it's very hard to learn how to do that. So we design tests that are more a measurement of students' literacy abilities and gaming the system abilities than actually really differentiating and distinguishing what students know if they know this particular construct. So I think one thing is that we have to help teachers really understand kind of good test design and good assessment design. I think that's number one. I think number two is really assessment is about instruction. They're so intertwined. And I think most teachers that I know and I work with would tell you that's true. You're constantly assessing as you teach. It's what you do. It's like the air you breathe. I look over here and I see you're struggling. I go to you. I'm assessing by walking around. I'm assessing by asking questions, by observing, by listening. And, it is the bureaucracy that has taken, it's the system that has taken these two things that are so intertwined and broken them apart and made them separate functions. And I would say then made particularly the summative component very onerous and punitive and biased. And, we all have our, I don't think it's that bad and it serves a purpose, but yeah, I can see that it's highly problematic, especially for certain learners. So I think we have to help teachers with that instructional component too. And then, I think, and to do it in an online system, then you obviously have to understand. So we have to help teachers with good assessment design, particularly test design. We have to help teachers with good instructional methods. I think as Andrew, you mentioned, we have to help teachers do good instructional design. Here are the most important determinants and standards of your learning, the ones that matter most. And here's how we're going to design activities that get to those, but here's how we're going to design assessments that actually measure them. The complexity now is we have to do it in technology, within a technological environment. So we have to teach teachers how to use that environment, but also then use tools that are specific to that environment, whether it's peer grade or Kazeno or online rubric graders, et cetera, rubric developers, while also not losing sight of the most important thing, which is to teach well and to assess well, because assessment is truly powerful. This is why we all go to the doctor every year.
Thank you so much, Ms. Burns. My next question is to Mr. Ghosh. You talk about different dimensions of assessments. So in the context of assessments being beyond just academics, so how can a teacher practically embed assessments for SEL, which is a growing field and everybody seems to be interested in it? So how do you embed that component of assessments?
That's a really nice question, Aaryan. Thanks for that. I think it's very, very important to focus more and more on the social and emotional needs of children today. I think the easiest way to do that is to do a self-assessment. So self-assessment about how they are feeling with regards to behavioral indicators, whether they easily get angry or not, whether they are very happy in helping someone else or not, do they enjoy solving a problem which is unknown to them. So I think these are some of the aspects which can be easily put forward, and this will form the results which will emerge out of it will be very crucial for a teacher or for an educator to know about that learner deeper. So first, I think, is to make that connect, that all important connect and care before we start even the first step of content delivery, or for that matter, academic assessments. So in order to make that connect and show that concern and care, I think self-assessment is one very important part to do. The second one is, I would say, involving parents. So I think parents are a very, very crucial and important stakeholder into this entire ecosystem. So I think taking a conversation and very clear and candid conversation with parents about the benefit of their child and focusing on individual development plans depending on where they are. I really like the way Andrew pointed out that it's just a kind of a broad spectrum, then they move from one position to another, so it's only level up. So I think that's the way to go forward. And I think the more the even when it comes to academics, for that matter, I think we need to be more mature enough to accept self-reporting of grades, because that again is very closely related to behavior. So whether a child is taking ownership of his or her behavior or his or her learning. So everything taken together, I think, has a very meaningful point in the social and emotional behavior space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh. My final question is to Dr. Pandey. We talk all the time about moving from assessments for learning, moving towards assessment for learning from assessment of learning. So this is not something very new. So what do you think? Where does the buck stop? Why has this not been implemented? This you see across the world. So it's always like majority cases are where there is assessment of learning and not assessment for learning. So where does the buck stop? Does it stop at the teacher who's teaching in the classroom, or at the principal pedagogist, or you call them as head teacher or principal, or is it at the education boards or school management? So where does the buck stop?
Yeah, thank you, Aaryan. I think you have partially answered the question also, and the remaining answer has already been given by the panelists. But let me make a couple of distinctions here. Distinction number one, assessment for learning is happening perhaps up to the primary level in a very, very large part of the world, and certainly in the progressive schools in this country. But as they move to the middle school and senior school, and there comes the devil, and the devil is the external exam and the dependence of the result of that exam to college admissions, and college admissions depending upon the professions that they will choose. So this cycle determines what kind of assessments we have, and therefore we resort perhaps unwittingly to assessment of learning. And despite the regulation, despite the training, and despite even the boards also suggesting it, educationists like the panelists here suggesting it, I think the schools willy-nilly, they see the larger purpose is to get them into a good college. And therefore, the formative assessments take a backseat, and the summative assessment, which are largely assessment of learning, takes the driver's seat. But the question is how to undo it. And undoing it will lie largely in bringing in the realization that the cognitive skills and socio-emotional skills had to go hand in hand. If at all somebody has to be rather in the driver's seat, it is the socio-emotional learning that has to be in the driver's seat. And if that comes in, then probably we will have to start focusing on the fostering student agency, giving them opportunity to take projects, engage in community work, raise their voices, take a stand, and then develop those human qualities in them. And that will perhaps make the beginning of what all of us are envisaging in this particular panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Now we move to the next round where we take questions from the attendees. So if you have questions, please raise your hand by clicking on the reaction button at the bottom of this, or you can leave questions. So we have a few questions.
Yeah, in the meantime, till the questions come, one gentleman from UK has commented something beautiful, and I wanted to quote it. And he said that assessment at the end of the day is an act of love. I thought all of us should know that. He has commented
That is beautiful. No, that's actually beautiful. So there's one question from Kamal Preet. Can you please share good examples of assessment that we can emulate in K-12 given remote learning? So who'd like to take this question? Quickly, if we can have 30 seconds in response.
One of my
okay, yeah, go ahead, Andrew, go ahead. Yeah,
I was going to say one of my favorite ways, it was already mentioned, a conversation. Most of the time, just a phone call, a quick video interview. We have the tools to do that usually. And really, I think we need to leverage those more. I think for some reason we don't, but it could be that a student does so well and then you go and talk to them and then you're like, oh, they get it. It's just that the method that I gave them, they were somehow unable to do it. The traditional test, for example, didn't do it, but when I talked with them, they got it. Well, then that's great. So just conversations.
Yeah, may I come in? I do not know the subject she teaches, but perhaps, one thing that comes to my mind is, if she is a physics teacher, ask your students to research how physics is involved in eradicating, mitigating, controlling COVID-19. You can do likewise if you are a chemistry teacher. You see, I mean, we have to innovate certain things and do not have to go to the treaded path. So innovation is key to assessments. And it is not always right or wrong answer. It is how much research you put in, how much communication you bring to it, and how do you present it. And therefore, the assessment at the end of the day is also to give you an opportunity to express, communicate, and present.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. Now we have Ms. Vinita Bagga. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I would like to get a question from you luminaries that they say reduce the screen time, reduce the screen time. This is all which we are listening and seeing everywhere in all the platforms. Can you tell me what will be the exact which amount we can share it for junior classes, the primary classes? Like, will there be any measurement or you can say yardstick to measure how much time should be given to which particular class?
Ms. Vinita, you have any questions specific to assessments or reimagining assessments?
Okay. So
you could refer to our previous panel discussions where we have had a discussion around this. So the links are available on our website.
Yeah, my question was, I earlier also asked, sir only answered that question that it should be a combination subjective and objective both. But if I would like to go about only subjective assessment, will it be okay in this time?
Okay, so who'd like to take this question?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't hear it. I don't know if others.
So what she's asking is if we can take subjective testing rather than objective testing in this point in time, will it be okay?
Will it be okay in this current?
So, what? I mean, I think testing should be as objective as possible. I mean, I think one of the issues, and that, you know, when students say to you, "Why did I get this grade?" they're asking a lot of questions, you know, but one of the things they're asking about is your subjectivity as the person who's grading them. Like, why did you give me this grade? You know, what was your basis? What was your judgment? What was your set of values? So I think it's important to try to make our assessments as objective as possible. I'll defer to my colleagues here, but by having some tool, whatever it happens to be, whether it's a quiz or a drawing or something, but I think making something as objective and fair and transparent as possible for students, because there's, you know, if it's a summative piece, there's always a kind of a marking component. And I'm really talking about this in terms of a summative assessment, so that students know what the measure of success is, why they're being graded, et cetera. But if you're doing it for a formative assessment, if you're trying to check in with kids and see how they are or what they know or how you're doing as a teacher, you know, I think then you can use kind of more, I don't want to say subjective measures, but certainly more informal measures that certainly don't need to be graded.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you need, I agree, you need to be as objective, and that's why tools like a rubric and other things like checklists help to remove the subjectivity as much as possible. And this is critical for those, I would agree, maybe a more performance or summative type items.
I also think, however, we have to be careful without playing with words about the subjectivity of objective criteria, because what somebody who has the great pleasure of working around the world, one of the things that really interests me is the variance, particularly around core skills, that in country A, this would be deemed the criteria would go from 1 to 5, but in country B, as it were, the criteria go from 4 to 10. And so somebody who is top grade in this country to skill is at a very different place to somebody who is top grade in this country. So I think we really need to objectify the criteria that we use around the world, because I think we're misleading some kids to say that you're really, really good at this. You're really, really good at it compared to your colleagues in this class or in your local environment. But globally, you could be way off the standard. And I think that internationalism and the global economy demands that we get some equivalence across these competency frameworks.
I think I just want to add very quickly in 30 seconds, one point is more than whether it's an objective test or a subjective test. I think it's the choice of questions. So I think Mary had pointed out earlier as well that how you are designing the tool. So let's say tools need to be designed having a mix of, let's say, some curious questions, some, let's say, discussion oriented questions, which are called the circular questions, some, let's say, clarifying questions, some challenging questions. So when that kind of an assessment is being undertaken in a conversation mode, so you actually get deep dive into understanding whether the conceptual area has been mastered by the learner and the learning outcome has been achieved or not.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh. So I have a final question before we move on to the next round. So the question is from Ms. Annie Williams, and a question is to Mr. Miller. How can we move from time-based assessment to continuous evaluation or assessment for middle and senior school, taking into consideration the number of students in one class? So she's talking about the large number of students in the class.
Right, and this idea of being fluid with time, I think, is kind of the idea. And I'm not saying that we're gonna, break down all the walls and everyone's just gonna learn on their own, and we're gonna do all the. We've tried that in many ways, but I think one way to start is to have clear benchmarks, like of some of those skills. It's not that this is like, so you might have quarterly benchmarks or month-long benchmarks, but then you work with students to design those assessments. Some could be ones that you provide, like I have one that you can do. Some can be ones they say, like, here's some options, you do it, or they say, I want to do this, and then they go and they do it to show what those things are. And then you have clear criteria and clear articulations of what those learning targets are. I actually did this for a group of students who were credit deficient, and this is it's a whole nother conversation around that, but they were students who had not passed some of their courses in grade 9 and 10, and they needed to make up credit. So they designed personalized projects aligned to those targets they missed to make up the credit. And so I think it can work. You just need to have clear benchmarks and really work with your students to say, my role as a teacher is to meet all of you where you are at. Some of you are going to be in different places, and build that culture of we're not always going to be in the same place. And then even within your large class, build smaller cohorts. So it's not every child going, like this, but maybe this cohort is moving and reading in this area, and then this cohort in math. So you have some variance, but still some collaborative nuclei that hold it together, because kids still need to learn together. It's not that this is completely independent.
Thank you so much. Now, thank you, everybody. So we move on to the next round, and I would like to ask my panelists one question. In the next 5 years, what are the 3 things that you think should or will change about assessments and the way we look at them? So we can start with anyone. So you get about 45 seconds.
45 seconds, Aaryan. So I would like students' voice to come in the assessment on demand, and assessment that prepares for life. I know these are very uncomfortable things, but we have to learn to feel comfortable about these uncomfortables, as I said earlier.
Thank you so much.
So for me, Aaryan, I would say more emphasis needs to be on social and emotional learning and measurement of that. More focus on data with regards to the analysis and feedback. And I'll share a small little personal anecdote. By feedback, I mean a qualitative feedback and a meaningful feedback. So this is a personal anecdote. When I was in class, I think grade 7, and I was pretty decent in maths during that time. For some weird reason, in the half-yearly term examination, I secured 80 out of 100. And obviously, I was upset. And in the report card, the teacher had written, "Need to do better." So I walked up to the teacher, and on a very serious, without any malintention, I just asked the teacher that who needs to do better, me or you? So obviously, if a child is getting 80 out of 100 when regularly the child is scoring close to full marks, so that kind of a feedback, a qualitative feedback, doesn't make sense. So I think that feedback needs to be very qualitative over here. And taking cue to what Mr. Pandey said, I think providing choice to students is my third take, that to measure more of what students say and what students do, as I mentioned right at the beginning, in addition to what students write. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Miller?
Sure. 3 things. I mean, there's a lot of things I want, but I'll bring up 3 ideas. One is more student agency and student-generated assessment, where students take more ownership of providing evidence of learning rather than me having to do all that. I think I would hope that we would move where time isn't as much of a driver of assessment as it is just part of the thing, where it's not that we have to hold kids to certain benchmarks over time, but there's at least some level of fluidity to it would be just great, just some, just asking for a quick win here. And then finally, I really firmly believe we're going to be moving past the terms of summative, formative, and diagnostic, and just evidence. It's evidence, and we share the evidence where you are, and it doesn't matter if it's formative or something. Those are terms that I use as a teacher because I'm a big nerdy educator and I use those terms. But for kids, it all matters. It's all evidence, and we will collect it and share it and report on it.
Thank you so much. Mr. Jones?
For me, 3 things it would be that we embrace the science around appraisal, because the corporate, industrial, commercial sector have got a body of scientific knowledge around appraisal that is compelling. And it would take in many of the points that Arijit and Andy have already made about culture, that we require learning to be applied, that it's not the retention of knowledge, it's the application of knowledge at local, national, global issues. And for me, that, as I've already mentioned before, this will come as no surprise, that we start to focus on stage, not age, as a given. That'll be my three.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jones. Ms. Burns?
Yeah, I would say that my number one would be that we figure out how not just to focus on the product of student learning, but really on the process and the progress of learning. I think the second is that, that we really study and prepare our teachers to understand assessment. I mean, assessments can do really good, and I mean good if, people criticize No Child Left Behind here in the United States, but it really was this large-scale assessment that made us pay attention to the struggles of children of color in terms of learning, because we took that data and disaggregated that. The assessment can drive reform. But I think we need to pay attention to assessment design, because if we do this well, we will have personalized assessment, we'll have personalized feedback, we'll have personalized learning. And I think this is where technology through AI, through chatbots, et cetera, can make a difference. And I think the third area is specific to my own field, which is teacher education. And I just hope that we could measure teacher candidates' progress and their process and their products of learning and their fitness to be teachers, but really in ways that contain direct observable evidence of teaching in action, and that we convince policymakers and funders, et cetera, to devote time and resources to build assessment systems that produce data that people actually understand how to use.
Thank you so much.
Aaryan,
yes.
One good news Andrew has shared with us. I want everybody to know it. Somebody from Harvard was listening to our discussion, and they have just taken a decision to drop SAT scores requirement. So imagine the huge impact it is going to have, and what kind of assessments they will deploy to admit kids is now anybody's guess. But certainly it is not going to be your 95, 99% marks in physics, chemistry, or mathematics. It is going to be something which all of us are talking about here. So, Andrew, thank you very much for sharing this good news.
Thank you.
Are we taking the credit for this, Mr. Pandey?
No, I was just on my things is that, that more and more colleges are not looking at these standardized tests. And for Harvard, which is considered up there to say it, it was like, well, isn't that lovely?
And a number of major
that's a great news. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Dr. Pandey, your three. Yes, Ms. Burns. Please go on.
No, I'm just wondering, are they not taking, it's the kind of test, because it's really a norm reference test. So that's what we're looking, where we're comparing one student's performance to another student's performance, but we're still looking at criterion reference tests. And I think, and competency exams, I think that is important. So that's my little editorial, and I'll get off.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Pandey, we are left with your three ideas.
I have said it already.
Okay.
I was the first one to say that. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Dr. Pandey. So I think we are at the end of the entire panel discussion. I thank all our panelists for their amazing ideas, for sharing their valuable time with all of us. And I also want to thank all of you for having exchanged your thoughts and ideas on the chat sections of all across platforms. So I understand that we still have a lot of questions that we may not have been able to cover or answer them sufficiently through this panel discussion. And we look forward to hearing from you, your thoughts, your ideas, your suggestions on reimagining assessments. Please write to us on our email ID or tag us on one of your posts on the social media. I would be delighted to know more from you. Also, do suggest what you'd like to have on our panel. Say in terms of the topics that we have. If you have any suggestions, also do write to us. On behalf of Global Citizenship Foundation, the Council for Global Citizenship Education, and all our attendees, I extend my deepest gratitude to all our panelists for taking out the time from their busy schedule and enriching the discourse through their amazing ideas, insights, and experiences. Also, I would like to thank you for being a part of the OELF family and everything that you've been doing to advance this discourse on transforming education for human flourishing. The next panel discussion is on the 26th of June, and we will be exploring how can we effectively engage learners online. See you soon. Until then, take care, stay safe, and spread love and compassion. After all, like one of our panelists, one of our attendees said that assessment is all about love. So spread the love, compassion. Our world needs it more than ever before. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaryan. Thank you, Arijit.
Thank you.
It was
Andrew,
amazing.
Peter, Ms. Burns. It was absolutely fantastic having all of you. I would just like to share with our co-panelists that at least on Zoom, we had those 100 people and 99 of them stayed till 5 minutes before. So that goes to your credit, how you engaged them and how fascinating the discussions have been. Thank you very much. And I'm sure many hundred people were there on YouTube.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you. Have
Thank
a
you
great
very much.
Stay in touch.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Bye-bye. It was absolutely wonderful having you all.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night, Andrew, for you. And goodbye for rest. Thank you.
Thank you.